Now, I barely thought about the Bali Nine until a few weeks ago. I wasn't worried about them. I wasn't sure how many of them were left. They didn't even enter my mind. And I imagine it was much the same for you. I mean, really, who goes around worrying about the welfare of convicted drug smugglers, apart perhaps from drug smugglers and their associates? But out of nowhere came this plan to repatriate the 5 remaining members of the Bali Nine to Australia. Anthony Albanese apparently bailed up the new Indonesian President Prabowo Subianto at APEC and asked if we could have them back. Then Home Affairs Minister Tony Burke went to Indonesia a couple of weeks ago to work out a deal, and they signed it off last week. Why? I mean, why are we concerned with bringing convicted drug smugglers to Australia? I don't care if they're Australian. I don't care if they're remorseful. I don't care if they've already served 19 years. They're drug smugglers, heroin smugglers. I mean, had they managed to smuggle that $4 million of heroin out of Indonesia, and keep in mind, that's $4 million 19 years ago, so more than $6.5 million today, then Australians would undoubtedly have died. These 5 scumbags and their 4 other mates, 3 of whom are now dead without a tear being shed, would have killed people. Not with a gun, not with a knife. So unfortunately, they couldn't be done for murder, but with drugs. There's very little difference as far as I'm concerned. No one just dabbles in heroin. The only people to whom you sell heroin are addicts whose lives are at risk. You smuggle heroin into this country and you sell it because you have no regard for human life, only regard for your own profits. And these are the people that the Albanese government thinks need to be brought back to Australia. This was the Prime Minister earlier today.
This is an act of compassion by President Prabowo, and we thank him for it. After 19 years in Indonesian prison, it was time for them to come home. And I had the opportunity to speak to a number of the parents last night of these people. They are grateful that their sons have been able to return home. They did a serious crime and they have rightly paid a serious price for it, but it was time for them to come home.
I mean, sure, they've paid a serious price, but why was it time for them to come home? You know, I get the argument that Indonesian prisons are harsher and their sentences are harsher and all that, but let's be serious. You would have to be one of the thickest people in the world, living under a rock, to not know that Indonesia doesn't take kindly to drug smugglers. The Bali Nine tried it on in April 2005, and it was only 7 months earlier that Chappelle Corby was picked up at Denpasar Airport with marijuana. I mean, imagine looking at that as an Australian and thinking less than a year later that it would be a good idea to smuggle heroin out of Indonesia. They weren't just young and stupid. Well, perhaps they were stupid in thinking that they could get away with it, but they're victims of their own stupidity. They showed willful contempt for the laws of both Australia and Indonesia straight after a media circus over another Australian caught up in Indonesia's strict regime against drugs. They knew what they were potentially in for. We didn't make them go to Indonesia to smuggle nearly 9 kilos of heroin back to Australia. So why is it our responsibility to bring them home? Tony Wood's daughter Anna died in Sydney after taking ecstasy in 1995. Her case, you might recall, was a high-profile one in the fight against drugs in the 90s and early 2000s. Mr Wood told the Daily Telegraph that it's people like them, the Bali Nine, who bring drugs into the country, and every once in a while a user has a bad reaction to it and gets caught out and dies. I think of Anna every day. They say time heals, but you never get over losing a child. Organising the return of the Nine should never have been a focus for Albanese. That man is a dope, a fool. He's not very bright. And you can just imagine how former heroin addicts must feel today, how people who've lost friends and loved ones to heroin or other drugs must feel watching peddlers of the products that killed those closest to them, people who wanted to bring more of these drugs to Australia, be released into the Australian community. And this is the other thing. When all this started a few weeks ago, the suggestion was that they'd continue to serve their sentences in Australian prisons. But after they were secretly flown back into the country yesterday, they were released, free men. And not only were they released, they were flown here on the taxpayer dollar and then offered taxpayer-funded accommodation. Albanese said the government would support their rehabilitation and reintegration. I mean, for heaven's sake, here we are 9 days to Christmas, and I'm sure it'll be a fabulous Christmas for the families of the 5 drug smugglers who've just been brought back here, and hopefully it'll be a fabulous Christmas for you too. But for a lot of people, it won't be. There are people all over the country right now who've slogged their guts out all year, worked as hard as they possibly can to support their families, and they are tearing their hair out right now, trying to find a way to put on Christmas lunch next week without breaking the bank. There are parents right now sick with anxiety because they have to choose between the power bill or Christmas presents for their kids. And what are they getting from the government? Free accommodation? Certainly not. They're paying more rent. $275 off their power bill? Good luck with that one. I mean, I know what the government is spending here is small bickies compared to lots of other things, but it doesn't matter. What matters is that this government has presided over 7 straight quarters of household GDP decline, the longest household recession in half a century. And at one of the most expensive times of the year, the Prime Minister is more concerned with spending money on putting up drug smugglers and teaching them how to live in Australia again. I mean, they were welcome to come back to Australia under their own steam after their sentences ended. These 5 men are scum of the earth death peddlers. The Prime Minister may well wish them well, but I don't.